Welcome everybody to April Boston SABR meeting. We have a great speaker tonight, author and scouting expert Lee Lowenfish, as well as another scouting expert, head of the SABR Scouting Committee, Rod Nelson. Bill will be along to introduce them in just a bit, but I wanted to open with just a really short anecdote, and actually, I guess it does kind of have a scouting connection, because the person I'm going to talk about is somebody who might not have been scouted as well by the team that signed him as he could have been, because they ended up letting him go, and he became one of the greatest pitchers in baseball history. The story revolves around Sunday. I had tickets that my wife had surprised me with to go to see Itzhak Perlman play at Symphony Hall in Boston, and it was an unbelievable show. But before going to the show, I was sitting having brunch with my wife, and who came walking across Huntington Avenue and into our restaurant and by our table, then I would say the pitcher that you would most connect with being a maestro of a symphony in the history of Red Sox baseball. Anybody want to take a guess?
Pedro?
Yes, you are correct, Joanne. Pedro Martinez walked by our table. I said hello. He gave me a big smile before going into his secret back room. And I just thought,
That's bad.
When would you ever, on one day within an hour, see the two outstanding people in their field and be within a few feet? Because I had great seats for Perlman. And also universally liked. I mean, people that are just known as being not only the best, but also incredibly generous, charitable, wonderful people. And I don't know if there's any Pedro anecdotes in Lee's book, because unfortunately I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I do know that Tommy Lasorda wishes he had maybe had a little more faith in Pedro. I think he was originally signed just because they signed Ramon, and Ramon said, sign my little brother, but they let him go because they thought he was too small. But anyway, that's my little anecdote for the day, and I will now pass us on to Joanne for some scouting-related poetry.
Yes. Always a good way to start, get a little culture in. Anyway, I had used two verses in the announcements going out for this program. I don't know that everybody got them, especially if you don't get the Boston chapter emails. But anyway, so I will do the entire thing. It's not very long. Okay, so the title on the poem is Hitless Means Useless. The scouts who take the early trains and sally forth new men to hustle are dazzled by a show of brains entirely overlooking muscle. They hand us a lot of bunk about their fast and fancy cattle. They load us up with useless junk that would, with the stick, can't make a rattle. All season on the bench they sit, they cannot hit, they cannot hit. I care not if he cannot run as fast as you can kick a barrel, or if his feet weigh each a ton, the grease spots cover his apparel. I don't ask he should not strut or pose when cameras are popping, but that he fancy capers cut, what time the screaming pill he's stopping. For all that, I don't care a bit if he can hit, if he can hit. Tell me not that he is there with all the cunning inside ifix, nor that he is a perfect bear with all those signal hieroglyphics. Tell me not he smothers bunts and spears aloft the whizzing liner. Tell me not at fielding stunts he is the first man in the diner, that cuts no figure, not a whit, he cannot hit if he can hit. Come not to me with tales of what he did while playing out in Kansas, that he can error never got, even though he had a million chances. Tell me not that he's awake and keeping other teams from scoring. I want him not to mar or make. When not at bat, he may be snoring. The question come right up to it is, can he hit? Oh, can he hit? Now, the interesting thing about this poem is another little twist as far as baseball doggerel at this period. This is between 1900 and 1920. This actually on the lines is actually a parody of a poem that was written by Longfellow. And there I have a whole collection dozens of poems, baseball poems that were parodies of Longfellow's work, including Hiawatha and all the rest of them. But that's what he has done with this poem here. I had another one. I will not impose it upon you, though, but it was a Damon Runyon one, which was really great. It was about the big league scout. I have about 7 in my Scouts cache here and everything. But other than that, I will not impose it upon you unless you beg me for it. After the meeting, you can send me an email. I can send the rest to you, but
We could close the meeting with it.
we could, yeah. The Damon Runyon one is much more artful. Yeah, it's slightly less doggerel. So we'll hold that one in abeyance. So what I wanted to do is we will forge on with our speaker tonight. We're going to have Lee Lowenfish tell us about Scouts and what he has found out about them in particular. And Bill Nowlin is going to lead us on with the discussion. So Bill, on with it.
I am mainly going to just welcome everybody again.
Yeah.
I'm known as SABR Virtual for this evening, as you can see in the lower left-hand corner of my screen, I guess. This is the book that Lee has written and that I've enjoyed, and so has Rod Nelson, who I asked if he could join us. I'm sure he was going to anyhow, but Rod is the chair of SABR's Scouts and Scouting Committee.
Yeah.
It was Rod and Jim Sandoval that got me really interested in Scouts to begin with, and SABR's entire, as he pointed out recently, SABR's this whole recent 12 years of books that have come out through SABR over the last dozen years began with the one that Jim and I put together called Can He Play? Look at Scouts and Scouting. And one line at the beginning of Lee's book that I really found interesting, there's kind of 2 lines, because it seemed to look forward to a possibility that maybe some of us had given up on. He does say at one point, the practice of eyes, ears, advanced scouting of major league teams during the season has all but vanished. But then a couple of sentences later, he said, it remains to be seen whether eyes and ears scouts will make a comeback in the foreseeable future. That is possible. It does help to look at players, to think about them, to think about their family background, to think about what you can see in a player's makeup that maybe can't be measured by pure metrics. We've certainly got a lot of advanced metrics going on these days, and they pay off in a number of ways. It's just maybe you can't have just one dimension either way. But I'll turn this over to Lee. And Lee, tell us about what inspired you to get involved in the subject and this book in particular, and how you went about putting it together. Welcome.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with SABR people. I mean, connections with SABR has been a big part of my life since I decided that teaching was not a permanent occupation for me. And I met Tony Lupian at SABR at Paramus in 1978. And that friendship developed into the first book I did, The Imperfect Diamond, which that was subtitled The Story of Baseball's Reserve Clause System and the Men Who Fought to Change It. And it's since been come out in 2 more editions. And I quoted in the first edition Mort Saul's line about Nixon's 6 crises, that it should come out in a loose leaf edition, so you could add the crises. And that's kind of been the history of labor in baseball. And I decided, though, I tired of just writing about things that were really depressing. And I love the stories of baseball. In fact, just in the introduction tonight, I want to get to Pedro Martinez and Pedro Martinez Jr. before I finish tonight. And I also want to talk about Damon Runyon, because he appears in my book. Because the first part of my book, after an introduction with Bertie Tabbitt's A Good New Englander's dream of getting scouts into the Hall of Fame, the next big chunk of my book is the story of how Branch Rickey developed the farm system with Charlie Barrett, his great first scout, and others from other parts of the country. And by 1926, they won the World Series and beat the Yankees. And it was Damon Runyon who wrote in his national column that Charlie Barrett is really the man behind the scene, because he had gone to every park he could see to develop the players, to sign the players that Ricky's coaches would then develop into major leaguers. And it was Runyon who wrote this column after the 1926 World Series saying, all hail to Barrett, who proved that you can develop for modest prices a world championship team, and you don't have to lay out the big bucks that the other owners were doing. Big bucks in the context of the reserve system, of course, you know, peanuts in today's world. With me, though, the great thing about baseball and why I wrote this book is that I've known scouts for more than half my life. And as I mentioned before we went on, my father was a dermatologist, and he had baseball umpires as patients. One of them was Bill Stewart, who I never met, but my father actually won a workman's compensation case for him in 1952 when Leo DeRocher spiked him and it got infected. I checked with the league. The league doesn't have records about it, but one day I do want to write something about it. The other umpire who I did get to know was Babe Pinelli. And Babe Pinelli is famous for a lot of things, maybe most that he was the plate umpire for Don Larson's perfect game. It was the last perfect game, the last game he ever umpired behind home plate. And he would come to the house for dinner at times. And I have very vivid memories. I mean, first my parents said, it's his day off, don't talk about baseball. Sure. So I talked about baseball. I remember him saying, Johnny Unitas, boy, what a great quarterback he is. And here is this undrafted guy that the Steelers left. I also remember, this had to be 1956. Yeah, that Jackie Robinson, you mark my words, he's going to make trouble outside the game too. I listened. I mean, I wasn't going to talk back. And so as life developed, I finished Columbia, went to Wisconsin for grad school, was always going to games when I wasn't in school. I went to Milwaukee to see the Braves. Later was at the game in 68 when the White Sox would play 9 games as a threat to move from Chicago, the way O'Malley threatened successfully to leave Brooklyn by playing games in Jersey City. And then I started teaching in Baltimore, where I became an Oriole fan. And then I moved back to New York. Baseball was always, I was always going to games. I remember, I think it was the 76 strike. Rochester played a exhibition game in Memorial Stadium, Baltimore, and it was free. And I went and sat behind home plate. I mean, first row. I mean, people thought I was going to go out on the field. Then a couple of years later, I meet Tony Lupien and I start writing. Then I was doing radio in Baltimore, in New York, and I meet somebody who says Stomp Seaver wants to do a pitching book. And that's how I got to do The Art of Pitching, which is a hard book to find now, but we were both gratified that so many kids learned the basics of pitching and the mental parts as well as the physical part. And then as time went on, I continued to be a fan, and again, it's the influence of SABR. I was up at the Hall of Fame and I saw an exhibit on Black baseball, and I decided that more should be done about Branch Rickey. And so that sort of led to, I rediscovered John L. Smith, who had really not been written about for a half century. He was the money man behind the Dodgers as Rickey and O'Malley started to spar. And so slowly that evolved into the Branch Rickey Baseball's Ferocious Gentleman book of 2007, and then updated in 2009. All along, I was still meeting scouts. And one of the scouts, in fact, my first friend, was again another patient of my father. I saw Billy Blitzer, a lifelong Cub Scout, after getting his apprenticeship in this scouting bureau that doesn't exist anymore. And I met him at a game, and I said, "Are you related to Ida Blitzer, who was a patient of my father?" He said, "Well, that's my grandmother." "Are you related to Dr. Lowenfish?" "That's my father." Well, he introduces me to Herb Stein. I mean, Blitzer winds up signing Sean Dunston, the #1 pick in the country. Later, Jamie Moyer as a 6th round pick, stories of which are in the Blitzer chapter in my new book. And he introduces me to Herb Stein, who signed Rod Carew before the draft and signed Frank Viola, Gene Larkin from my alma mater, Columbia, got the World Series winning hit for the Twins. And they introduced me to other people. And in some ways, one of the titles for my book I thought of was Each One Teach One, or Competitors and Colleagues. But I got to know a lot of them. And as a result, I came up with a book that I think is timely, because eyes and ears scouts are the essence of the game. And you simply cannot, I mean, baseball is such a complicated sport, and it's such a sport about loss, that you have to know mentality. And so, and there are no easy answers to most things, but this good scouts have to make a choice. But I can say, as a historian and as a scout and baseball lover, that you cannot scout a player solely by video. And I think teams are beginning to understand it, but it's going to take a while. But that's the genesis, and a sort of a long way of saying, Bill, how I came to write Baseball's Endangered Species.
So tell us about for those who haven't read it, tell us how you put the book together and what it embraces and how it's organized, the baseball monogamists and more.
Right. Well, I got to know Bertie Tebbetts, or interviewed him once, and he was called a Horatio Alger story of his day, because he's a poor kid, fatherless kid from the age of 3, but baseball mad, born in, raised in Nashua, New Hampshire, though born in Burlington, Vermont. And I read his diary that came out after he died, in which he told so many great stories about scouting, about Paul Critchell, the Yankee scout, coming to his home, trying to sign him, and Bertie's widow mother says, "My son's going to college." And Bertie writes a letter. I mean, Critchell writes a letter back saying, "Oh, we're not going to interfere with his schooling," but he winds up signing with the Tigers by the same scout who signed Hank Greenberg, because they knew how the Yankees were stacked. And of course, they already had Bill Dickey. So I decided to start with his dream of getting scouts into the Hall of Fame that he talked about in his book. And it was a challenge, Bill, because the whole thing with scouting is that they've been company men. And Bertie spells it out, and as do other scouts. Red Murph, in a book that I found actually remaindered at Cooperstown, he becomes another chapter in my book. They don't want to talk out of school, and whatever they find is the organization's property. Critchell said it himself when he was interviewed, rarely, before World War II. But, you know, I like to talk to people, and if they know I love baseball, and I began to get some insights into this from old magazines and interviews. And the Branch Rickey book, I certainly was able to talk. Most of his scouts had passed away by now, but I did get to meet Rex Bowen, who was and the thing with Rickey, when you were a Rickey man, you were a Rickey man for life. He signed so many of them as players. And the thing, to get back to my point, is that it's the game of failure, and the scouts are the ones who probably went through it in their lives as players, and they understand maybe better than certainly those coming out of the business schools what it means not to have the major league talent, but to know what it is. And so I decided the first part of the book would be how Rickey and Barrett and Pop Kelchner and the East Coast developed the players that beat the Yankees, and really the only team that beat the Yankees during their dynasties in 26 and in 42. And then how the Yankees themselves, after they lost 3 years in a row to the Connie Mack's A's, 29-30-31, something that never made Ken Burns' series because it wasn't glamorous, and Connie Mack was not liberal on the race issue, but I believe you can't write people out of history because of that. And so the Yankees developed that farm system beginning in 32 under George Weiss. And so I told that story in the first port. Originally, I thought I was going to do more about the coming of the draft in 65. But the fact of the matter is that there are stories, and the Art Stewart chapter deals with it in detail. Stewart, being a guy, if he had his way, was a Chicago kid who loved the Yankees and became a Yankee scout and signed Boughton and Fritz Peterson and got a lot of yucks from his colleagues about their later lives of Boughton and Peterson. And Stewart said very openly, they were successes. They were not highly touted, and they made the majors. And you can't control what happens afterwards. And so Stewart, though, when the Yankees start coming under CBS and they lose their edge, he starts with the Royals, and he's there. Well, actually, he was still with the Yankees when the draft came in, but he understood that the rich will always have power, and that it's still, there are a lot of people who want to beat the Yankees, the Dodgers, and the Cardinals. And he became one of those with the Royals. And so for the rest of the book, there were stories of people who had great successes and had great insights into the game. And Stewart was actually a two-team. He wasn't a monogamous, but he was with the Yankees and for the rest of his career with the Royals. The monogamists, who were really great scouts, were Paul Snyder, still with us, who was with the Braves from the time he was a minor league first baseman, wearing glasses, and that probably didn't help his career. And then he became a lifelong Brave. And I tell the story of Bill Lucas, who was the first black general manager, although Ted Turner didn't give him the title, and who died very young. But they built that system that ultimately resulted in all their at least league championships. So that was the first one. Then there was Billy Blitzer, who I've known, for more than half my life. And then Gene Bennett, who's the Rickey man from Branch Rickey country of Scioto County, Portsmouth County seat. And he was with the Reds for his whole career. He signed Don Gullett, and he knew Don Gullett as a junior in junior high school was going to be a star. And so, and then we wind the book up going full circle back from Massachusetts and New Hampshire with Bertie Tebbetts to Bill Enos, who got his dream job in 1973 as key area scout for the Red Sox, and had the stature to pass his mantle when he retired onto two scouts. One of them, who I got to know, Buzz Bowers, who played at the Michigan State thanks to the advice of the great Robin Roberts, and Ray Fagnan, still an active area scout. And I closed the book with the story of how Fagnan and Yankee scout Matt Hyde run a program every summer for prospects from high school and college. And the game is dedicated to Kelly Rodman, a rising Yankee scout who I got to know at some of the dinners in New York. We have a picture in the book of her when Anthony Volpe signed. And she was a full-time Yankee scout who developed a brain tumor, passed away 3 years ago at the age of 44. And now the end of the Fagnan Hyde Yankee Red Sox competition in the summer, that game this year will be August 25th at Polar Park in Worcester. And so the spirit of scouting, trying to find that arm behind the barn, and as the old scouts used to tell the younger scouts, there's a Hall of Famer out there, you find him. That's the spirit that I wrote this book. And so again, in this long answer, I've tried to bring in what you were talking about a little earlier tonight.
remind us, if you will, as it gets much closer to that game, a lot of us being from New England, I think we'd like to make the trip out to check out the game.
Oh, definitely. You know, I was on with Rob Dibble in the last couple of weeks in Hartford, and it was a very, very supportive interview. And I've let them know up there. And since, you know, I call myself a cultural historian, I've been introduced in some places as, you know, what's a cultural historian? Well, he tries to find something connected in just about everything. And the co-host for Rob Dibble is a man named Ben Darnell. So after the interview, I said, "Are you related to Linda Darnell, the great noir actress?" And he said, "She was a distant cousin, and they both went to college in Angola, Indiana." So if that isn't an example of everything is connected, I don't know what is.
You know, you mentioned very right at the beginning, Tony Lupian. I don't want to waste everybody's time here, but he's one of the major influences on my baseball research from almost day one. When I started interviewing people that knew Ted Williams, the first thing he asked me is, "What position did I play?" And I froze because I hadn't done my homework. And he said, "Why should I talk to you if you haven't even done your basic homework and you don't know what position I played for the Red Sox?" So that taught me a lesson pretty quick.
Oh, no, Tony was a great guy. And still, he had 5 daughters. And one of them I'm pretty close to teaches piano and just got a degree in Sufism up in St. Paul. And he played, he was just, I've learned so much from him. And I know if he were around, he'd be glad I wrote about Bill Enos, because he mentioned the scouts in that first edition of Imperfect Diamond, and he himself was a scout. In fact, you know, when he coached Dartmouth, among the players that made the major leagues were Jim Beattie, Pete Broberg, Chuck Salbach, and an infielder that. So I mean, he knew his stuff, and he also brought joy to the game, and that's the other thing. You have to have joy in this game, and that's what I miss in analytics, and I hope it's changing. You know, since the book went to press, Houston has hired a lot of. Now I'm not sure that's the same people they hired. They brought back the scouts that Jeff Lunau, you know, fired, and so. And the Yankees and the Red Sox have done pretty good jobs at keeping their scouts. And, you know, the problem is, and it's a problem throughout baseball history, there's not many well-run teams. There never have been. But we have to hope for the best in that. At the same time, we can't forget these people like the scouts who did so much to sustain the game.
I wanted to mention 2 people. I had mentioned, Lee, that Ann Enos might join us when her own Zoom session of Baseball Memory is completed. She has joined us. She heard the tail end of you talking about, she came in when you were talking about Ray Fagnan. And all. Hi, Ann.
Hi, everyone. And Gail, my old friend there.
The other person I wanted to mention, I have never met before, but Rod Nelson pointed them out. I don't know if I will pronounce your name correctly or not, but David Scrivinas, is that your name? And you are a scout for the Red Sox at the moment?
I am, yeah, it's Scrivens, but yeah, no,
Okay.
I appreciate it. So just real quick, I do the independent league coverage for the Red Sox.
Well, you've got a lot of fans here then.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm certainly open to questions. I mean, the dialogue is so important.
Yeah.
Well, I was curious, Lee, you said you were going to tell Pedro's story.
Well,
So I'm curious about that.
the Pedro story was, I went 2 years ago. I've been to 2 of the Kelly Memorial games, and actually the first one, it wasn't called a memorial because she was still working. It was at Yankee Stadium, and I saw a high school player from Arizona hit a home run into the right field, the short porch, but it was quite a shot. That player was Cody Bellinger. 2 years ago, I was at Fenway, and Pedro Martinez Jr. was playing in the game. And I think he goes to the Lynn University in Florida. And it wasn't just Yankee and Red Sox scouts. There were scouts and coaches from a lot of organizations. And it's just so important that they be around professionals who know what they're doing. Because what, the worst part of the analytic craze is that a lot of the people are looking for the next best thing. But yeah, I'm not sure that's the greatest goal. And again, I quote early. I always have thought about if Branch Rickey were alive, what would he think about today? And I have a quote in the book from Branch Rickey was asked, how much of baseball did you know, Mr. Rickey? And a lot of people, not everyone, but called him Mr. Rickey out of deference. And he said, I don't think I know 55% of the game. Well, that means there's a lot of 45% out there, and most of us don't even know, 1/10 of that. So there's just no substitute for watching how they react to failure. I mean, Joe McIlvaine, a great scout and GM for the Mets and the Padres, told me that he was the sadness he had about Dwight Gooden was that Dwight Gooden soared through the minor leagues and he never had any trouble. And you don't want that trouble to happen before 50,000 people, especially in New York when it's too easy to fall under bad influences. So I think it's so important that the family connection and how people, what they show of themselves, and more than half the players are scouted or pitchers because they show themselves on every pitch, and you have to watch everything about it. And one of the great points that Seaver made in The Art of Pitching was you have to know when a guy beats you on a good pitch, on that particular pitch. You tip your cap. You also have to know when you've thrown a horseshit pitch and you get an out, because that's not going to happen most of the time. And when you see the injuries that are happening and the supposed can't misses that miss, there's got to be a better way. And I suggest drawing on the wisdom of the veteran scouts is the better way. I mean, Jerry Krause told me when I interviewed him years and years ago was that he never saw an older scout get worse. And when he finally had enough of Chicago and spent the rest of his career scouting for the Yankees and the Mets, and as he said, he started in Chicago around Lou Magullo, and who I get into the book, the man who signed Kubek. I have a great story about Lou Magullo, who signed Kubek and signed Skowron. And Krause learned that these people feed. And he said, I started when I was a gopher. They didn't call me an intern. I was a gopher.
It's interesting how a number of the scouts that you mentioned did not begin their careers. Well, they were players often, but not even that sometimes. And they ended up in scouting.
Yeah, well, it's funny. You're talking before, his name is not coming up. So about going to see Itzhak Perlman, there is something about the greatness in the arts and the greatness in sports, maybe especially baseball, because it's the hardest to master, that are very, very connected. Larry McPhail, for all his volatile temper and his lack of progressivism on race, used to have the Yankees sponsored a New York Philharmonic program when he ran the Yankees briefly after World War II. He also had an organ in his house. He was a very accomplished organ player. And I think in one of maybe in Lee McPhail's book, that Eugene Isterman, the great piano player, classical pianist, gives a wonderful comparison between the gifts you have to play music and the gifts you have in baseball. In fact, Critchell, I quote in the book, when Critchell talked to the press, not a little bit more deeply, he talked, what does a great pianist have? He doesn't know he has it, but he has it. And you hear this so many times when you hear talk about scouts, like Rich Gedman said about Bill Enos, who signed him out of high school, undrafted. Bill knew things about me that I didn't believe myself. And you hear that
Mm.
a lot of times in the stories about scouts and players. So, it's why I wanted to focus most of the book on their stories.
I'm curious also, Lee, and by the way, it's Saul.
Oh,
You mentioned Mort Saul before, but mine's the first name. But what are the things that all the specializing in baseball now? I'm curious if any of the, young kids who just all they do is play baseball, whereas, a generation ago, guys was three sport athletes, and they developed muscles, and they things that they learned in other sports that they could apply to baseball. I'm wondering if there's any thought about that, if that ever comes into the book and into the art of scouting.
well, that's definite. I mean, it may not be, I'm sure it's alluded to, because most scouts I've talked to want to see players play other sports. One, because they relax the baseball muscles. Two, because they're not likely to be Ohtani that can do anything, and they want to see how they react to when they're not the star. Because that, Dennis Sheehan, one of the great scouts who is now an official scorer up in Hudson Valley, and he was with the Braves for a long time and highly respected, said that what he misses is they're not teaching people how to be teammates, and that comes from good programs. And so your point's very well taken, Saul. I mean, it could be a danger sign. I mean, some people have suggested that Glavine and Maddox threw less pitches in their whole careers than some of these kids that burn out by the time they're 22, because they're playing all year round and often not supervised.
They're all trying to throw 100 miles an hour every pitch.
Well, I heard that Stan Bonson say on a show, another one signed by the Yankees, that if he had a magic wand, he would take the radar gun off the scoreboard. But now you got to laugh, because now every pitch, you got a launch angle, you got an exit velocity, radar gun. And is anyone surprised that Jordan Hicks with the Cardinals is having trouble? 105. It's such a basic, it doesn't need a PhD in advanced math to know that if you throw 100 straight, it's less valuable than if you throw 94 and 84. Change of speeds is really remains the key to good pitching.
We are a relatively small group here, so I think Carl Lindholm does have a question himself, but I think people should just feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. If too many people are talking at once, we'll sort that out. But
Hi, Lee.
Hi.
Carl Lindholm. This is just wonderful. I can't wait to read your book. I'm going to do 60 seconds, but I promise not to go longer. I actually have a question, but I knew Tony Lupian. He coached at Middlebury for 5 years before he went to Dartmouth and coached all those major league players. I had a first edition of The Imperfect Diamond. I lent it to a student at Middlebury College, and he lost it. He will always be on my list. I had one of my favorite first players was Bertie Tebbetts. I grew up in Maine, but I live in Burlington, Vermont. So Bertie Tebbetts is a name that I know. I have a nice letter from Bertie Tebbetts. All these points of connection. But my question is this: I grew up in Maine, as I said. So the major baseball figure in Maine, as you well know, is Clyde Sukeforth. And in your book of Scouts, how much attention do you give to Clyde Sukeforth and his scouting? He had many different roles with Branch Rickey, but wasn't he the major scout of Jackie Robinson? And do you pay attention to Clyde as all of us Mainers hope?
Well, I'm opening up the prologue, and in the very first paragraph, I mentioned that Bertie Pebberts was known as the boy wonder, catching as first a mascot and then a bat boy. My glasses are very fogged up, and he played for the local team, the Nashua Millionaires. I'll quote, all right, one of Bertie's first heroes was Millionaires catcher Clyde Sukeforth, who was on the cusp of his career as a baseball lifer, and the man who introduced Jackie Robinson to Branch Rickey in the first meeting of the two a couple of weeks after the end of World War II. Pebberts became so adept at mastering Sukeforth's moves behind the plate that he warmed up pitchers before the game. The Millionaires sent out a press release that stated, "Come and see the 12-year-old catcher." So, I mean, and I'm citing my dear departed friend, Bob Creamer. So Sukeforth I also just did a blog about going to the Jackie Robinson Museum, which just opened and everyone should visit in downtown Manhattan. So clearly, the spirit of Sukeforth is in the book. The guy who's on the cover, Tom Greenway, he was another one who scouted Robinson and saw him for the Kansas City Monarchs. You had Whit Matthews. The strength of Rickey and the Yankee organization is that it wasn't just one man. There was always a staff that was looking. So the spirit of Clyde is in this book, and the fact that he went to Pittsburgh after O'Malley kicked Rickey out of Brooklyn. So he's very much there. And in fact, another scout who again Rickey developed as a minor leaguer, Howie Hake, he was the one, along with Sukeforth, who saw Clemente as a Montreal farmhand with the Dodgers and gave the heads up. And Hake never learned any words of Spanish except 4. That's throw hard, run fast. So yes, that spirit is really there. And
quick follow-up. Holman Stadium in Nashua, New Hampshire is a great place to visit.
And it's got those murals.
It really does a very nice job of recognizing Newcomb and Campanella and Alston. Well, Alston not so much in the 1946 season, and 47 actually in Nashua. It's a nice museum. And also, I had a chance to go to Florida last year, and the original park of the Montreal team and Dodgers team in the 46 spring training. That park has become a wonderful museum too in Daytona Beach. So anyway, I can't wait to read your book, Lee. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you too, Carl.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah.
I don't want to put him on the spot, but I'd love to hear what David has to think as our scout in the meeting, if he has any insights to share about the modern scout and how he or she can, use analytics, but also look at the things that Lee's talking about. Look at the.
Yeah, I would too. Rod pointed out that one of the signings he had is Rich Hill, I guess, if that's correct. And he suggested, David, that you might talk about how the Red Sox prioritizes types of players needed rather than perhaps individuals that you might come across.
Yeah, sure. No, I appreciate this. This is great. And Lee, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. So what I do is actually a lot of traditional scouting, doing the independent leagues. I've got 52 independent league teams that I cover. And opening day is actually next week on the Indie League side. So a lot of it is going into the ballparks, trying to get, make up information on players and trying to figure out every indie league player is there for a certain reason, whether it's an undrafted guy that went undrafted and is trying to get into affiliated, or that former major leaguer who's been released, or the guy who's trying to get back into affiliated to get to the big leagues. But a lot of it is, there's not a lot of video with the independent leagues. It's a lot of traditional scouting. It's a lot of using sources, developing a rapport with managers, probably a lot of stuff that traditional scouts have done to get information to try to beat other teams on a player and that sort of thing. But we do have some video available. Just with what I do, it's not a lot. So we're a lot of it's the eyeball test, a lot of it's trying to figure out why players in the independent leagues, and we can look on Baseball Reference to see any player's history, but 95% of the players are what they were on Baseball Reference. So we're really scouting that 5% that made an adjustment, whether it's changing their arm slot, whether it's a sports psychology thing, whether it's maybe a player wasn't healthy and now they are healthy. Maybe it's a conversion player who maybe was playing out of position or had some arm strength, and we try to stick them on the mound. So I don't know, that's kind of like a little bit about what I do and what we try to do.
And all the independent leagues now are pretty much under the umbrella of MLB, right?
Right. And, big thing is with the rules experimentation, especially in the Atlantic League, and now the Frontier League and American Association are doing the same thing. But the other part is, there's a purchase price. So if we want to sign a player out of the independent leagues, Major League Baseball's kind of stepped in and gotten a lot of the leagues. The Atlantic League, American Association, and Frontier League are all $15,000 purchase prices to purchase a player's contract, whereas in the past every league was operating independently, no pun intended, and trying to set their own price. So Major League Baseball is trying to kind of level things out and kind of create a tiered system. But as the draft is now less rounds, and the independent leagues are now more teams as a result of MILB contracting. A lot of those teams, for example, the Pioneer League is now, those 12 teams that are in the Pioneer League are all independent, whereas, they're affiliated up until 2019, I guess. So more guys are being undrafted and going into the independent league. So it's an area that and I'm sure teams are going to start to cover the independent more.
You're trying to cover 52 different teams?
Yep. It's pretty easy, right?
How many games do you get to go to in a given day?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's trying to do as many double ups as possible. So that's that's the big thing, and trying to just be smart about coverage and try to get as many of them done as possible. So in the Chicago area, for example, there's about 10 teams within 2 hours of Chicago. So you can kind of go in there and line up some pitching matchups, maybe to see some starting pitchers. And then, a lot of the independent league managers are really good about, if I say, hey, I'm coming in, can you, throw this relief pitcher on tomorrow night, or that sort of thing. A lot of the guys are really good. It's a lot of former big leaguers, Butch Hobson's managing in the independent leagues, George Samus, a lot of guys like that, that kind of try to help us out. And because they're trying to help the players get back into affiliated as well. And, certain managers have a reputation as rereally helping to promote and get those guys back. So that's a kind of a recruiting tool that they use to sign players for their team.
I'll make a few comments, Bill. Here's the erstwhile biographer, Bill, working on it, the Alan Ripley bio. But three things come to mind. A fellow I worked with, a guy named Robert Stead, Stead. At one point, he was the commissioner for the Cape Cod Baseball League, taught at Dennis Yarmouth Regional High School. He he was also a scout. I'm not sure what kind, but he said it was grueling driving around New England, looking at players. He said it wasn't as romantic as I thought it could be. That was number one. Number two, I remember many years ago seeing Lenny Marullo at a Hyannis Mets game, Cape Cod Baseball League. And I asked him for a few stories, and the one that stuck with me, and you can either say, oh, that sounds a little harsh on the player, but there were a group of scouts right behind home plate, which there tend to be at the Cape Cod League games. And a player hit a ball, let's say to shortstop, and I think everyone in the world would say an automatic out, 6-3. And the guy kind of gave up running down first base. And Lenny said every scout took a pencil and crossed off the guy's name without even discussion. And I said, that sounds kind of harsh, Lenny. He said, the guy's probably done it before. He'll do it again. We cannot take that chance with a lazy ball player. And I thought, oh my word, the kid's only 18, 19 years of age. But that was one scouting story. And then the third one I wanted to share is I was looking through one of those, and help me, baseball fans, the spiral bound annual that is kind of a history record of the previous year. It's probably a couple of inches thick, paperback, spiral bound.
Not the media guide.
No,
Not
you're,
The media guide.
No, it's not a media guide.
you're probably talking about a blue book, a baseball blue book publication called the Major League Notebook or
No,
Minor
well, wait a
League
minute,
Digest.
would it be Baseball America, maybe?
It
Well,
could be, it could be.
In the back are obituaries of everybody who had died during that year. Well,
Spiral Bound, it would be one of the two that I mentioned.
yeah,
Published by, the name of the publisher is the Baseball Blue Book. Okay, goes back to 1909,
oh my word.
and it had all the directories. It was really all the operating rules and everything for minor league and major league. But then they published two spiral bound books that were, and the reason they're valuable to me and my research is that during the 90s and until they quit publishing in the middle 2000s, they would list the signing scout for all players in organized baseball. So it's very valuable for that purpose.
Well, the thing that I found is that it was like a recap of every league.
Yep.
Everything, high school, college, Cape
Yep.
Cod Baseball League, leagues that had 4 teams. And what I thought was astonishing were, and I'll use the word thousands, the thousands of baseball players in what I would call the minor leagues. And my assumption, they're all signed to some kind of a contract. Thousands all the way across the United States. And I'm thinking, who keeps track of all these players? Just, guys with 5 at-bats, guys with 400 at-bats, and so forth. It's a pretty impressive task that scouts have to sign players, find them, put them on a team.
Well, to just respond to that, Marullo, who I've interviewed, talked to his grandson, who is a coach and it was a catcher in the big leagues, Matt Marullo, and Lenny was, and Bill Enos, I believe, were the first two into the scouts, into first two people who voted into Cape Cod League Hall of Fame in 2000. And I don't think that was particularly cruel on Lenny's part. I mean, you can't take game. You don't have to necessarily be Pete Rose, but you have to hustle, and that was certainly the Ricky method. I have a story in my book about one of the scouts that really fascinates me, Charles Chapman, who known as Al, I think because when he played under an assumed name, Al Rogers, because he'd lose his eligibility if he was getting money in the summertime. And he felt that an imposition, as did Branch Rickey, who had the same thing happen to him. But Chapman talked about Charlie Barrett went to scout somebody in the mountains of Montana, spent days to get there. And when he found him, before he even played an inning, drinking it up in the bar, he didn't bother to watch him anymore. So, there are giveaways. I mean, now, of course, it's a much more permissive society. And if you have super talent, you can make leeway. But I don't think it's that shocking that he would have said that somebody who's jogging down the first base line is going to do it again, and that we don't want to waste our time. And what they would put in what CP can't play, or maybe add another more vivid adjective.
Stephen, you mentioned a cluster of scouts behind home plate. I've seen them myself sometimes, but Lee, my favorite story from your book was of Tony Lucadello watching Mike Schmidt fielding from the roof of a building so he could better assess Schmidt's lateral movement, see whether he could move to his left or his right. And therefore he ended up at third baseman because he didn't maybe work as well as a shortstop as a third baseman. And he could assess that because he went up on the roof of a building to watch him.
Yeah. Lucadello was and his brother, who actually played in the Johnny, who played for the Yankees, were great stories. Again, people who saw baseball as an outlet, a joy, and also a way to make a living. And he also developed his own wall that he took everywhere. And you talk about everything being connected. When I met Ray Fagnant, he told me that he went to Fostoria, Ohio, and actually got a brick from the wall that existed and created his own wall. His wife uses it in training softball players. It's designed in such a way that when you hit or throw a ball against it, you get the different bad hops that the great players will master. And one of the greatest comes from your area, not far, Mark Belanger from Pittsfield. So I love how this gets connected. And I guess my other gripe with the analytic people, who they really think they invented the game. And no, they didn't. The game, and you don't have to look for the next best thing. You can master some of the things that have been handed down as well.
I thought that was a great story too, bringing your own wall so that, catch fielders or hitting off of a wall. But
Lee, or
I have-
really any of
Gail, you had a
scouting
question, Gail?
experts.
I did.
Oh, I'm
It's kind of a
sorry. Go ahead,
personal-
Gail. Yeah.
It's a personal question. My dad was a scout, and I was wondering if you ever got to meet him. His name was Tom Giordano. T-Bone.
Oh, T-Bone. I love T-Bone. I mean, I'm
Me
glad.
too.
I miss T-Bone so much. I mean, he so many of the stories and his cooking ability, his love of cats. I mean, he was the perfect embodiment of the adage, will you laugh every day? Will you have fun every day when you try to hire scouts and players? Yeah. Great to see you.
Good to see you too. I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you.
A reminder, this is what it looks like. Baseball's
Cooking and
endangered
cats, what
species.
you look for in a scout. Gail, who is, Ed, do you have a story about your dad or anything, anybody he signed that we might know?
I can tell you that I happen to have a bunch of his scouting reports that were in the Diamond Mines exhibit at Cooperstown, and I just checked the my spreadsheet with all that data. The first one I pulled up we have is Felipe Alou. So how about that?
And he was involved in Eddie Murray's switch hitting and Cal Ripken, you know, so many scouts had Cal Ripken Jr. as a pitcher. And Tom was big on saying that he's going to be an infielder. And oh no, he and Hank Peters, who he was, and who I got to know Hank Peters too. And I mean, they're heroes, you know, and they really. I mean, Peters signed Reggie Jackson twice for the Kansas City Athletics, and
Well,
then
Bob Zuck signed it.
and he got involved in the trade for Don Baylor, and to give you a sense of what the Orioles meant and why I became and remain an Oriole fan, when Baylor was traded for Reggie in a big trade that involved the throw-in who never really made it because of bad eyes, Paul Mitchell. Tony Lupien told me that Mitchell pitched at University of Amherst, at UMass at Amherst, and when he pitched against Pete Broberg at Dartmouth, there may be 70 scouts were at that game, you know. So, and I whenever I feel down about this sport, and I go to a high school game or I go to a college game, and I see players, by the way, who don't need a pitch clock because they're not wearing all the gear yet, and there are no commercials between half innings, and they actually want to play, you know. So, you know, keep those local games and the summer games alive, because that's where some of the stars will come, and that's where the spirit of the game is refreshed day after day.
Lee, we have a fellow who graduated. I'm at Middlebury College, have been for half a century. And we have a fellow who graduated from here who did about a 15 or 18-year internship with not an internship, but he worked for the Washington Nationals. And now he's with the Philadelphia Phillies. And he's a scout at a fairly senior level, but he still scouts he still scouts the minor leagues, trying to find gems. He says, my goal is to find a relief pitcher that will put us over the top.
Mhm.
But I interviewed him at great length for an article that I wrote, and he strikes me as one of his jobs with the Nats was to translate analytics to the coaches on the field. And it strikes me he has a wonderful middle ground intelligence. He understands analytics and he understands their importance, but he also has come to know a little bit about baseball. So my question is the pendulum swinging back with Theo sort of not rejecting, but Theo amending his allegiance to analytics to try to bring baseball back to some sort of form that we understood it? Is the pendulums, and this fellow that from Middlebury that I think really knows baseball, but also knows the technological aspects of baseball, do you think the pendulum is swinging back to a more reasonable position about gut instinct versus statistical analysis?
Well, I hope so. You know, as I mentioned before, you know, the Astros have brought scouts back. It's not going to come from the top. You just hope that the top doesn't do dumb things. I mean, and you know, I know enough about how the world works that as the old boxing publicist told me, who was fighting cancer bravely for 10 years, how are you doing? He said, bobbing and weaving, you know. So you got to bob and weave. But I think there is a degree of hope. Even the fact that the minor league union was recognized, because Manfred knows his labor law, and it'll be a company union, but they're going to get paid more And that evidently in the contract, they've agreed not to remove any more minor league teams. You know, that was a tremendous blow when 42 teams were just kicked aside, because there still is an element in baseball in these complex leagues where they actually think you don't have to play games. You know, you can just read the printouts and stuff. And when you watch the game, it's mano on mano, and drama within every pitch, certainly within every half inning. So it might switch, and I sure hope so. You know, because it's such a challenging game, and you hate to see it robotized.
If you had one scout
Go
uh,
ahead, Carl.
that you could
Carl,
write
go
a
ahead.
whole book about, who would it be?
Well, you know, it's funny, you know, there's so much on Bertie Tebbets I didn't put in, because my goal in the book, the Branch Rickey book, was 600 pages, and I had a wonderful editor who is now American citizen. She's from Ukraine, and she's now American citizen working for the State Department in London as a published poet, a dramatist, wonderful woman, Nina Murray, and she helped cut that. I just didn't want this book to be as big, but you know, Bertie Tebbets is such a great story. And I paid a pilgrimage when I was in spring training to Anna Maria Island, where he lived his last years. Freddie Hutchinson invited him down there, and then Freddie died pretty soon, as did Earl Torgerson, who went down there. Bertie lived till 1999. But whenever he was interviewed, he wanted people to know that he went to Providence College and was from New Hampshire. So Tebbets is really a fascinating guy, because he was both an old guard guy, and he didn't want to tell stories, but he had vision. The other guy who just passed away, who was an amazing guy, is Gary Hughes, and I was glad I got some of Gary Hughes' story. I mean, Gary Hughes, whose son, one of his sons is now a Yankee scout, Sam. Another scout is with the Marlins in a clubhouse capacity. But believe me, the clubhouse and the trainers, I did a book with the trainers in the 80s on fitness. And I mean, the clubhouse and trainer people really know the players even more than the scouts and the coaches, because they know what really drives them in the moment. And so, you know, Gary Hughes was another started as a sports writer, and he and a teacher, and then he got into scouting, and he said his two great signings were two Hall of Famers, but they were Hall of Famers in another sport, John Elway and John Lynch. So, you know, Hughes is another one who, great storyteller and very, very humanitarian guy, you know. So yeah, there's, and I hope the book inspires work in a lot of regions. There are wonderful people in Texas and Maryland. I mean, there's an archive of Joe Branzell, who everyone loved, who was a Washington Senator Scout and Texas Ranger. It's up there in Cooperstown. You know, another philanthropic guy. So there are a lot of people out there, and I think, and you know, I think of Kelly Rodman, who was going to be a great scout. In fact, I was just researching one of the people she recommended. I told you Volpe, but there's a Guardian or Indian that I'm not going to fight that battle. Although I must say, if they're going to change the Braves name, why not change it to the Cowards? But that, you know, if you want to be different, if you're looking for the next best thing. But seriously, folks, she also signed, gave the heads up to Lenny Torres from Beacon, New York, who is now working his way up as a relief pitcher in the Cleveland organization. So there are a lot of good ones out there, but I certainly didn't quote some who still have jobs, who don't like the trend that it's going with, and we'll see. A lot of teams are not in great financial shape, and so we'll find out in the next year or two where the drift of the sport is going. To answer your question, Carl, I have some hopes, but I'm certainly, to use the popular term in baseball today, I'm not going to FanDuel to bet on it.
Thank you.
Ooh,
Carl, what's the name of your friend from Middlebury?
His name is Eric Dalton. Dalton. And he's a fairly high level scout for the Phillies. And now he's in his 40s. So I'm quite encouraged by him in the sense that I think he understands the whole game. He's not a nerd, a stats nerd. Forgive me for using the term, but I think he understands the game, and he really, really is smart, which is sort of the.
Related to Harry Dalton, maybe?
No, he's a Vermont guy. He was a hockey player at Middlebury College, and he wanted to. I won't go on and on, I promise. But he got a sports management degree at UMass. Thought he would like to do something with the NHL, but he got a job with the Washington Nats and just went from the bottom to a pretty reasonably responsible position. Spent 15 years there, moved to the Phillies just in time, and seems to be in a good place. You could, this is terrible, but you could look up Carl Lindholm, Eric Dalton, Addison Independent. You could see an article that I wrote recently.
Well, if he started with the Nats under Mike Rizzo, he certainly, got a
That's right.
good education, because Mike is the son of a scout. He just
Yeah.
passed away, Phil, and they came out of the inner cities of when baseball was the national pastime,
Yeah.
and so they knew they had a talent in evaluation, because back then kids wanted to play baseball. There was no big threat from basketball or football yet. Now it's a different, and I just hope that talking about this and my writing about this opens up people to the beauty of baseball, that it doesn't have to be on a video game, and to dispute Manfred saying the kids want this. If you teach the kids how beautiful the game is, maybe some of them will come in. But it's a calling. It's extremely hard, and that's one of the problems. Because the game takes long to master, and so, but we do the best we can.
Walt, did you have something?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think there seems to be, and maybe it's from Moneyball, I don't know, but this sense that traditional scouting and analytics are two polar opposites that are not. Every successful baseball team blends both of them today. You cannot learn everything you need to know about a hitter from his exit velocity any more than you can learn what kind of major league player he's going to be by interviewing his prom date. It's the smart teams, the successful teams. Yeah, I suppose there was a time when people perhaps trusted what I always call the magic eyes of scouts that frequently would give us players like Sean Abner with the #1 pick who never did anything. Their scouts have biases just like statistics have holes in them. So I think it's probably misleading to pitch this as a battle between one side or the other. I really think the smart teams know you need a little bit of both. And I know they're the Jeff Luhnows of the world who try to McKinsey-ize baseball, but that's one comment I'd have. And I guess the other would be, you mentioned Mike Rizzo, and Mike Rizzo is very committed to analytics as well as to scouting, and he has significantly beefed up his analytics department at the Nationals. So again, it's not. I don't think it's one or the other. I think many voices talking together get the best outcomes.
Well, the interesting dynamic, which frankly I don't discuss in the book because would be so hard to find out. The dynamic is not just between the scouts and the analytics people; it's between the analytics people and the owners. And
Sure.
So many of these owners made their money in hedge funds, cutting corners. I mean, I don't wish the Mets ill, but boy, I would find it hard to root for Steve Cohen. I mean, but he's not the only one. I mean, so many of these people made their money, hedge funds, and they've been sold the bill of goods that analytics can develop players through our algorithms in ways the old timers just wasted your money. And I say that's not how you develop players,
Well,
but you know,
but there's a reason why there's a reason why general managers use analytics. They work.
yeah.
I mean, they work.
I love a little
answer
good-spirited
questions you
debate here.
can't
This is
answer
awesome.
anywhere else.
Can I ask a question? We haven't really touched on it much, but with players moving around so much now, the importance of scouting existing major leaguers and trying to see whether they will fit with your team. I mean, I just think of, can this guy handle Boston? And, we have great examples we all know of guys who just weren't a good fit here, like Renteria and Sandoval, that were all-stars in several other places, but just couldn't do it here. And just that's something where maybe analytics and the eye can maybe come into play, because the analytics, of course, is how well can this guy perform in this ballpark, but then you also bring into play the mental aspect of how well can he do in the intense environment of a Boston or New York.
Well, in response to analytics working, how do you explain that last year, for the first time in the long history of baseball, 4 teams won 100 games or more, and 4 teams lost 100 games or more? And if you look, and I'm not making any predictions about after 3 weeks, but there are 4 teams now that I don't think we're going to see 500. So I mean, how do you explain? How do you explain that?
I have a very easy explanation for that. It has nothing to do with analytics. It has everything to do with baseball economics. You have several teams in baseball that frankly are not trying to compete, that are getting so much revenue. The Pittsburgh Pirates get more from Major League Baseball's central bank than they're paying their roster. Okay? They don't need to win to make money. And
Pittsburgh Pirates are going to
compete.
They're going to compete this year. So just be careful what you're saying.
Oh, okay. You can define.
Okay, I mean, are you suggesting that they're not competing? Okay. The team that they just swept, the Colorado Rockies, which I happen to know a little something about, that's the example that you're looking for. That is the team that chooses not to compete and will be looking up at 400 by the end of this year.
Well, or the Oakland A's. The Oakland A's are another very good example. And, there's a financial piece there too. But the bottom line is the Pittsburgh Pirates are not going to spend the money it takes. They will spend to a point and only to a point. And however far their team gets, fine. Has everything to do with the ownership in Pittsburgh, which I'm sure you're probably pretty familiar with. There are owners in baseball. There's an owner in Cincinnati as well. They're going to make money, but they're the opposite of Steve Cohen. Yeah,
I'm curious about my question though.
That has nothing to do with analytics. That has to do with economics.
Anybody have a thought about scouting?
Well, you're talking about pro scouting as opposed to amateur scouting.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And
one of the things
senior scouts get those jobs.
One of the things they did away with was the pro scouting, advanced scouting.
Right. That's
which
all
used to, scouts would follow a team. When I was doing that book with SABR, we talked about reading who's hot and who's not on the team he was going to pitch against. They gave that up. Now, the thing about baseball where I throw my hands up is that smart teams will do this even if other teams are not going to do it. But since Manfred wants to centralize everything. I don't know now if teams could do advanced scouting if they wanted to. But, you know, people will say the disparity between the rich and the poor has always existed in baseball. That's perhaps true, but it's the imbalance of team quality is pretty it's pretty sad to see, and and the amount of games you want to see. Well, now that the American League East is only 13 games instead of 19, that's really aesthetically speaking, and that's a lot of my perspective, is a loss, because there are going to be a lot of good teams playing bad teams, and you know that's not what competitive balance was supposed to be.
Well, except that we go back to the 1920s and 1930s and look at the Yankees and the St. Louis Browns and the Philadelphia A's and the Washington Senators and make the same argument.
Boston Braves.
You know, I agree with that, and I used to believe that, Andy. But the thing about the Senators, especially the Senators under the Griffiths, is they did develop players, and they developed great scouts too. And even Mac did, you know. So it was, you know, so now
those guys did not. Those guys literally did not have the money to keep those teams together.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily buy that argument with any of today's professional sports owners. It's not between the rich and the poor. It's between the rich and the really rich.
Yeah.
But look at the model of something like the NFL, where it's incredible how competitive almost every game is, because they have the salary cap.
Yeah.
Well, what they have is revenue sharing, 100% across the board. And you know, I'd argue they have institutionalized mediocrity too. A salary cap is not the answer.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
It's a good point. The games are competitive, but you don't have the elite like a Steeler.
It's hard to stay really bad for really long in the NFL.
There is a question that was on the chat about why is pitching so hard to find today? Anybody want to take a crack at that one? And also, will we see pitchers go back to pitching to contact instead of trying to strike everybody out?
Well, I think pitchers break down more often, and that really saddens me, since it's such a special skill. And the Rays, I believe, and you know, this is where I don't I look at statistics. I just don't want to be captured by them. I think that the Rays, acclaimed for competing on a low budget, they've had more TJ operations than I think any team. Another one just went down, Springs. And so I think that's that kids are throwing too hard too soon. And again, I think the Andrews, who has made quite a career on the Tommy John operations, Andrews has written a little pamphlet to parents and kids about not throwing too hard too soon, but they don't listen. The money and the fame is thrown out, and so it's an endemic problem, and it concerns me.
Well, it is kind of interesting from my very naive point of view, but I've always found it kind of fascinating where a comment I heard a few minutes back, it doesn't seem to take a long time for a player, and I have no evidence, I can't give you statistics here, but if you're thinking of a high school student, and then going into the college game, you know, a team doesn't wait years to sign somebody. It's a pretty young age. And it seems to me many ball players are pretty young in the major league level. And what I find kind of fascinating is that, you know, you read somewhere where Carl Yastrzemski started off as a second baseman, let's say, or you know, oh, Joe is going to come in with that 8-run differential. And we all know him as a center fielder, but he pitched in high school. So we'll bring him in to pitch. And it just seems like the players just know the game. They're all over the place, and the scouts have to kind of discern where that player or the coaching staff will be best used. And I'm still thinking that any major league pitcher, even if they're just terrible today, could strike me out on 3 pitches, you know, and I always get a chuckle.
It could be 2 if you don't get out of the box.
Yeah,
fast enough.
exactly. And the other thing I find fascinating is just where do all these great players come from? You know, I'm from Cape Cod, and I can't, other than, you know, the old timers, I can't think of one guy that's made it to the majors, you know, from Cape Cod. You think of all the high school games over a century and so forth. Just so fascinating how people are found. Like, where do you find a great pitcher? And it kind of comes to mind. And again, this is a memory thing. Wasn't Walter Johnson found out in Idaho? And I'm thinking it's 2023 to go to Idaho. That seems like a different world for me today. You know, what was it like 120 years ago? How do you find somebody? How do you literally say, hey, I'm a 50-year-old adult. I think there's a 15-year-old phenom up in Aroostook County, Maine. Let's go look at him. It's just remarkable where you find players.
I think you should go to the Dominican, Stephen. You have a better chance.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Thank you, Saul, for that reminder. Yeah, that's like, you know, baseball's in the blood there.
No, here's the deal. The 15-year-old from Aroostook is named Carlton Willie.
Yeah.
Oh, now, wait a minute. Now, Carlton Willie-
I think a player will be found anywhere. What fascinates me is the way the Negro Leagues found players. You know, they toured. And if a kid on another team was a good player, the next day he was on one of the Negro League teams. I mean, I don't think there are uncut diamonds out there. I think they'll be found wherever it is. What I'm interested in is when I mean, I was a pitcher of modest ability, but we had starting pitchers and we had kids who couldn't start. You know, they weren't good enough to start. And when I pitched, if I went 5 innings, I had failed. And nowadays you have kids who are relief pitchers from day one, and they throw hard on every pitch. I think kids are expected to throw as hard as they can on every pitch. And
that's probably the big factor in why they're breaking down.
exactly,
Except that pitchers have always broken down.
that's true too.
Tell me the time in baseball history when pitchers did not get hurt.
My
Well,
favorite pitcher at the Red Sox is Smokey Joe Woods. And he won 30 games, and then he hurt his arm and he played in the outfield.
I had the pleasure of interviewing Smokey Joe Wood in 1981 and heard that story from his mouth. But yes,
Great player.
Well,
and Smokey
Carl
Joe Wood
Lindholm.
could hit. But he was another one. Smokey Joe Wood grew up in Colorado and Kansas, and his first professional baseball experience was dressing up as a bloomer girl
That's right.
because he had a baby face and he was the hardest throwing pitcher in the league. Yeah, I mean, where do you find it? I think travel baseball has had an effect. I think a lot of the players are homogenized today. I'd like to see more John Walkenfuss batting stances out there today. You never do. Everybody's got the same delivery, the same stance, the same load at the plate.
Well, that's why the World Baseball Classic is so wonderful. I mean, you really see the spirit. I went for the first time this year with my son, and you really see the spirit of the game and how it's played in different countries. And you know, the Japanese team, so wonderful. I mean, just the fundamental baseball of every guy on there, and
every
just,
left-handed hitter steps in the bucket.
You do see some different kinds of stances. And I admit that I was one of the guys who used to not like the guys who showed a lot of excitement after home runs and this and that. And I still don't like it when they stand and stare, but I've gotten to really appreciate a little more, even though there was something wonderfully stoic and, you know, about a guy running around the bases with his head down. But the guy showing energy, enthusiasm, I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with it if it's done the right way.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Every other sport does it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what you're also going to help us with our kids and getting them to love the game, is seeing that exuberance, which they've been showing in other countries forever.
Sure.
Carl
I'm going
Lindholm.
reminiscing. Remember
Carl-
Warren
Carl
Spahn's,
Lindholm.
remember Warren Spahn's motion? Remember Juan Marichal's motion? Do you
Yeah.
remember Satchel Paige would double and triple pump? And
Yeah.
now the stretch and the windup is exactly the same.
Kenley
A little bit
Jansen,
of a
he
pivot,
stops
and there's
halfway
no-
through. I love Kenley
there's no-
Jansen.
There's no variability. The only people who show anything that at all different from the cookie cutter modalities, physical modalities, are players from other countries.
Yep.
Anyway, I don't know what that means. I'm just,
Well, that means they haven't been grabbed by American coaches yet. I mean, that's what it means.
yes.
But Jansen, there's an example of, I don't know who it was in the Red Sox that thought, okay, everyone thinks this guy is maybe on the downside and won't be able to adapt to the pitch clock. But I'll tell you, I've been to 3 games he's pitched in, and he just has looked lights out. I mean, they really have
Who's
an
this
ace there.
all? Who
And you
who-
have
who
to,
are you-
you have to look at his heart too, both
Yes.
physically.
Physically,
and-
yeah,
And,
metaphorically.
you know, he's the catcher. I mean, you talk about the Dodgers had him as a catcher, couldn't hit, but they liked his arm. And, you know, he's from Curacao, and he's really, you know, I mean, the Curacao story is really, really amazing. And there's another project that intrigues me about how Curacao and Robert Einhorn, I think one of the big Yankee farmhand, had a
Mhm.
cup of coffee in the big leagues. He's one of the guys that helped develop that program. And I think Bert Blyleven, being the pitching coach in the World Baseball Classic, was a tremendous, a few years ago for Curacao, was really well, I guess for Netherlands, but I think they were the combined team. That's a great
Well,
tip
and you know,
for his
you
cap.
look at like the catchers that come out of Puerto Rico, all following the Molina path, the Ivan Rodriguez path, all the shortstops that come out of San Pedro Marquerie. And you'll even see mannerisms in the players that echoes the guy that they grew up watching.
Yeah.
Well, that
Carl
goes back to where we
Lindholm.
started tonight about how the scouts, you know, the old scout that teaches the younger guy learns it at his feet, and then he goes on to the next guy. I mean, that's what analytics doesn't have, that kind of storyline.
I mean, the heartbeat.
Mhm.
I was at a clinic, the Be the Best clinic, a couple of years ago, and Pat Murphy spoke. And it's kind of a nice story. Pat Murphy
Was a
Uh,
coach.
was Craig Counsell's coach at Notre Dame. And now Counsell made him his bench coach in Milwaukee. And Murphy went on to coach Arizona State, and he had Pedroia.
Mhm.
And he said that when players wanted to know what the strategy should be, is that follow Pedroia. And that once that Pedroia came back after he struck out, and he muttered, "Boy, he's nasty." And Pedroia said, "Boy, that was the wrong thing to say, coach." And every time he struck out from then on, you go get him, you know. And so it's that kind of spirit that the
Sure.
good coaches and the good scouts have. And as my voice is becoming rather raw, let me close on that kind of note that Murphy stressed, and the good scouts stressed, that every player has a heartbeat, and that you can't get out of a computer.
Absolutely.
And that's where the better teams of the future will be built from. So
Yeah, that's what
Thank
Louis
you for-
Tiant always says. Yeah,
Thank you
can't
very much, Lee.
no heart in a computer.
well,
Thanks.
maybe I'll
Thanks
see
very
you in Worcester.
We've kept a large number of folks here that have been interested in the conversation. And yeah, let us know about Worcester. Just remind us, and we'll spread the word within the New England chapters.
Can you
Okay.
tell us about Worcester? Tell us about Worcester one more time, because I didn't get it.
It's April, it's the
August.
last, April 25th, Friday afternoon, the Kelly Rodman Memorial Foundation game between the one team will be dressed in Yankee uniforms, road uniforms, others in Red Sox home uniforms, and it's quite an experience.
Is it,
and
is
there's one-
April or
and
August?
I'm sorry, it's August
That's what I thought,
25th.
yeah.
Oh,
And
thank
does the
goodness.
money go to cancer research or something?
Yeah, well, it's free. I mean, it's.
No, no, I bet you,
yeah.
okay, but I just
Yeah.
wonder if it's a memorial, is there,
Yeah.
is
yeah.
there a
Well,
charity that's associated?
it's her foundation that her partner has founded. And it's more information. They're also having an event at a mini golf tournament in June, June 1st, more in Connecticut. I'll get that information to Bill and to Joanne, and you can spread it.
If you haven't been to Worcester yet,
I-
you should get there.
And you talk about America. Worcester is a great place, and Pawtucket got screwed.
Mhm.
But,
mean,
but
there's no-
Worcester's still a
there's-
great place.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been to the ballpark. I love McCoy Stadium. Red Sox fans should have loved it with all the paintings of Fred Lynn and Burleson and earliers,
Some
But-
people think Worcester, Pawtucket screwed up. They might
Yeah.
have gotten screwed. They might have screwed up,
Mm,
but the Worcester
Pawtucket
experience
was only guilty of being Pawtucket. I
Yeah,
mean, it's another mill town in Connecticut on,
Yeah,
you know,
Rhode Island.
in Rhode Island. I'm from a mill town in Connecticut, so that's why I said that.
Right,
I'm from Meriden, Connecticut,
I've
but
been to Worcester.
but
though.
there's
It's a
so
pretty
many
nice
stories
experience.
like that.
all right. Well, listen, a
Anyway.
pleasure, guys, and
Thank you so much, Lee.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you very much.
Great job.
Great job. Thank
Oh, and
you.
a little, we hope to at the next meeting in either May or June, we hope to have Dan Epstein and hopefully Ron Blomberg to
Blomberg.
talk about their book, The Captain and Me, about the relationship between Blomberg and Thurman Munson. And so be on the radar, lookout for information about that.
It's about the Yankees.
Well, it's about the special relationship. I know. Yeah.
Well-
Well, we're
Well,
equal opportunity
Muncie
here.
played in the Cape League, so.
Well, okay, that.
Yeah, and we I don't know. We can and the first DH game was against the Red Sox, so
We're
there's that.
open-minded, yes.
Hey, the most recent book that SABR put out is on Yankee Stadium, and I helped with that one.
Oh,
Wow.
Bill, gone over to the
Carl,
other side.
Going
We
into the
forgive you.
devil's den.
Yeah.
We forgive you.
Carl
I guess we
Lindholm,
can wait for your next
um,
poem, Joanne.
Before we have Joanne's poem, Carl Lindholm, a
Uh-oh.
very good friend of mine, is the great nephew of Carlton Willie.
Whoa,
And we've talked about him. He has a little file about him. He may even have a baseball card of him and talks about him on occasion.
Cherry Field, Maine.
Yes, and my friend, his name is Kimball Willie, would go hunt with him in Maine.
The
And when
great
I
thing-
started-
and I'm sorry, Lee knows this so well. The great thing about Clyde Sueforth was what a Mainer he was. He went back to Maine every winter. He was a total Mainer. So it's that Maine doesn't have many major league figures, but Willie and Sueforth were real Mainers.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Carl.
Thank you.
Joanne, you don't have to do the poem today. It's so late, but if you'd like to,
Please.
It would be a nice way to wrap things up.
yeah, absolutely.
You have to come on.
Joanne.
Yeah, there I am. Yeah, anyway, instead of the long poem, it's the Damon Runyon poem is really long, but I do have a smaller thing that's kind of like a good parting shot. It's from Charles Dryden, who was a writer, Chicago, back around the 1900s, Anyway, this is what he said. Charlie Dryden, the baseball writer, has a scheme for capturing the Allen gang. Send Ted Sullivan after them, advises Charlie. He has dug up more disreputable characters out of the bushes than anyone else in the world. And Ted Sullivan was one of those early scouts of baseball back around 1910. So that's, I guess, part of the job that scouts have to put up with, as we have heard tonight, about digging up talent. And it's been an ongoing thing ever since baseball was started, because they were scouting around, maybe not as far as wide, but they were still scouting around even in the 1850s and the 1860s and the 1870s. They had people that were going around looking. So we're still doing it. So with that parting shot.
Thanks,
So-
everybody.
But if anybody's really, really up for the poems and everything, you can email me and I'll send you the
I'm
file.
gonna do that.